And we're good whenever you want us in.
Welcome to the D3 Datacast Men's Basketball Tournament Selection Spectacular Recap Show. Matt, we spent Sunday afternoon tracking all of the games. We had 8 men's basketball games and 5 women's games we were tracking. And there's no waiting now for the bracket reveal tomorrow to know who's going to be in the field, right? They didn't need to finish the games and have the committees go into their calls to figure out what the regional rankings would be and how that might lead into their at-large selections. It's just a matter of running the numbers, which we were doing as the games were going live throughout the day. Had a lot of fun on the live stream. Hopefully, a lot of viewers got a chance to check that out. Thanks to everyone who stopped by along the way. If you didn't get a chance to check it out, maybe at this point the blow by blow action isn't so relevant. But we were pleased to be joined by some special guests along the way. So I think there's a lot of good conversations, uh, a lot of value there for people who might have missed it to go back and a lot of good discussions I thought along the way about just kind of this first year of NPI playing out as we're seeing it make the tournament selections. So Matt, let's jump into what the action on the Sunday brought us. We had, as I mentioned, 8 men's basketball games to look at, tournament championships across the country. It started the day with a noon tip in the NESCAC where Trinity sent the Wesleyan Cardinals to their first loss of the year to claim the NESCAC tournament championship in the automatic bid there. Yeshiva got a win over Farmingdale in the Skyline final. Ithaca knocked off RPI for the Liberty League championship. Guilford finished off a really impressive run through the ODAC tournament with a 79-74 win over Roanoke. F&M got a win over Johns Hopkins, which kept a team alive on the bubble, but St. Norbert knocked a team off the bubble by virtue of their win over Wisconsin Lutheran. St. Thomas was another one that kept some bubble hopes alive with an overtime win against Trinity, Texas in the SCAC championship. And then the final game of the day, it came down to the final seconds. The final at-large bid hung in the balance. The final seconds of that SCIAC championship out in California. It didn't tip until 5 p.m. in the East. But it was a 72-71 win for Claremont Mudd Scripps, who moves on to the NCAA tournament through that automatic bid. And Kalu will see their season continue, as we'll talk about. We knew they were going to be very safe heading in, and CMS was very much not safe. They needed the win, and they got it. So, Matt, let's just quickly recap all of the automatic bids that were awarded to men's basketball teams. Congratulations to Pitt Bradford, Central, Hardin-Simmons, Newman, Franklin, and Marshall. Highlighted in yellow here. They got that win on Sunday, so all the Sunday winners are highlighted in yellow, and everyone else who had already had their bid going into Sunday is in white, which also includes John Jay, Mary Washington, Illinois Wesleyan, Huntington, Western New England, Utica, St. Joseph's, Maine, Franklin, Drew, Ithaca, Keene State, Westfield State, Calvin, York, Pennsylvania, Delaware Valley, Grinnell, St. John's, Trinity, Connecticut, Clark, Montclair State, Husson, Denison, St. Norbert, Lewis and Clark, John Carroll, Guilford, Chatham, Yeshiva, Barry, Claremont Mudd Scripps, St. Thomas, Greenville, Cortland, Bryn Athyn, NYU, Bethany Lutheran, Pfeiffer, and UW Platteville. That's 43 automatic bids in all, leaving 21 at-large bids to round out the 64-team field. And that was not set, as we mentioned, until the final seconds. But Matt, the first one of the day was an easy one. We knew that the loser of the NESCAC championship game was going to claim one of those automatic bids. It's just a matter of which one was going to be, or excuse me, an at-large bid. It was just a matter of which one was going to be in via the automatic bid, which would be going in via at-large bid. And with Trinity's win over Wesleyan, Wesleyan gets knocked to the at-large bid status, although they maintain their number one overall spot in NPI. So effectively, it really doesn't change anything for Wesleyan except for the fact that they're entering the tournament as a one-loss team instead of the lone unbeaten in men's basketball play. But here, Matt, this is just an NPI order, right? So this is the order that the final NPI rankings selected these teams into the tournament. Again, starting with Wesleyan, then it was Emory, UW La Crosse, Randolph-Macon, Tufts, Hampton-Sydney, Christopher Newport, WPI, Hamilton, WashU, Ramapo, Carthage, Roanoke, Stockton, Redlands, Wisconsin Lutheran, Cal Lutheran, TCNJ, Chicago, Catholic, and the last team in the field. Matt, we were watching the Pool C cut line all day play out as the numbers changed, as some games went to bid thieves via upset. That last team in the field here is Gettysburg. And the team left out as a result of that Claremont Mud Scripps victory, the team on the wrong side of the bubble, that team right below Gettysburg, Gustavus Adolphus.
Yeah, we went into Sunday kind of knowing who was the team that had some life left, right? The bottom of the list was Virginia Wesleyan, and it was Gustavus Adolphus, and it was Gettysburg. And we just kind of knew as games were going to be ending, if it was a bubble bursting game, you're going to start crossing teams off the list. So a team like Gettysburg, they do end up as the last team in the tournament, going in with, I think there's about maybe like 4 bubble bursting potential games on Sunday. They knew they could survive 3 of those, but not 4. They could survive 2 of those, but not 3, I think. And we had Wisconsin Lutheran lose. We had Claremont Mud Scripps beat Cal Lutheran, so those were 2 games. So Gettysburg survives, but a team like Gustavus Adolphus doesn't survive. So it's really interesting to follow the games that way. We had a lot of drama at the end. We had overtime between St. Thomas, Texas, and Trinity, Texas. That was like the second to last game. And then we had that kind of final possession back and forth game with Claremont Mud Scripps and Cal Lutheran. It looked like that was games on Flow Sports, but it looks like what happened was that Cal Lutheran had the ball back with maybe like 5 seconds left, 5 to 10 seconds, somewhere in there. Got kind of a drive in with a tough look, missed it, offensive rebound, couldn't get the putback. So kind of 2 chances there for themselves to win the SCIAC championship and to keep someone on the bubble that doesn't go in. And unfortunately, I think that was Gustavus Adolphus that had their bubble pop at that moment. So these are the types of things that we can know in this NPI system that we were following along all Sunday. As with each result, we know, boom, which specific bubble was popped. And we followed along as that happened.
Just to go a little bit deeper into the bubble here, Matt, I think as we entered the day after Anderson had lost in their conference championship game the night before, we knew that Anderson, based on the simulations you ran coming into the day, that Anderson did not have any chances. But they finished the 3rd team out. I want to jump down a few more because 6th out was Trinity, Texas. For much of the day prior to that SCAC championship game, they were occupying the number 20 spot, right? But as we were saying throughout,
Yeah.
just because they were in that Pool C spot right there, of course, the only way to get to, to need consideration for an at-large bid is to lose, right? So if they were going to need that at-large bid, that means they were taking a loss. And so we knew that had they, if they were going to suffer that loss, which they ultimately did, being in that number 20 position was actually a bad sign and not a good sign. So we see here after suffering that loss, they dropped down to the 6th team out. Matt Trine ends up the 5th team out. The defending champions will not get a chance to defend their championship from a year ago. If my record searching is correct, they become the first defending champion to not qualify for the next NCAA Division III tournament since Babson, who won the 2017 tournament and then did not qualify in 2018.
Yeah, and we know how the bubble was shaping up all week because we were following it. I think what it ended up being was kind of a normal amount of bid thieves or bubble bursters. I don't know if we have an exact tally right now of how many we think we had or didn't have, but a team like coming into the week, a team like University of Chicago. I think on last week's episode, we were thinking that their game with Wash U, their UAA finale, was going to be kind of a play-in game, win and in, lose and out. They did win that game and they are in. But I think running some numbers on Sunday night now after the fact, if they had lost that game to Wash U, Chicago would have fallen between where now you see Gettysburg and Gustavus Adolphus. But that would have been, they still were in Pool C, so that would have kept their Pool C position. They would have been the last team in. If that was the scenario, they would have been the last team in still. So Chicago, so I think that was still showing that maybe overall for the week, it was a normal to favorable position on the bubble. Then again, we were thinking most of the week if a team like Calvin had gotten to the tournament final that they were standing. Well, actually, like a week ago, it looked more 50-50. And then it looked really good when the week started out strong for bubble teams. And then I think now after the fact, had they lost the tournament final to Hope, they would have been just between Gettysburg and Gustavus Adolphus, which for Calvin as an additional Pool C team would not have been good. And they would have been out kind of in that same situation that Gustavus Adolphus is. So I think at the end of the day, we probably did, we'll maybe go back and count at a different point. We probably did get that like four bid thief number somewhere in there. So it's kind of a normal type number. It wasn't like a 7, but it wasn't like a 1 or a 2. But that's how it ends up.
And it really will come down to how you really want to classify a bid thief, right? So we saw Guilford win the ODAC over a Roanoke team that was going to be safely in the field. but at sort of your mileage may vary as to how you think of a bid thief, right? Because the win over Virginia Wesleyan in the quarterfinal and then Randolph-Macon in the semifinal had really played themselves into
Yeah.
good position. So there's a little bit of a dynamic here where it looked like it was a softer bubble playing out for much of the week in terms of the bid thief situation. But while that was the case, maybe for teams looking up the standings, there was also that dynamic with Guilford kind of making a charge up
Yeah.
with, when you're in a conference like the ODAC and you have that kind of path, those are a couple of very, very significant wins that give you the ability to chase some teams down from behind, which is what I think we saw from Guilford. So
Yep.
that kind of fits in where maybe by the time we got to that final day, you wouldn't necessarily classify them as a bid thief. But coming into the week, you
Yeah.
you probably would. So it's a matter of where you take that snapshot. And so if you want to exclude them, in
Yeah.
the final tally, you kind of still have to account for the fact that
Right.
they charged ahead of the field really and
Yeah.
claimed their spot that way.
They used up a bid that it didn't look like they were going to maybe use up going into the week, but they won the Pool A, but had they lost the
Right.
tournament final, it looked like they would have earned a Pool C resume and then would have
Correct.
rightly earned their own Pool C bid. So coming into the final day on Sunday, we didn't want to call them a bid thief because they had earned their Pool C spot, whether or not they beat Roanoke on that last day, I think.
Right. They were kind of in that same range as maybe just behind Catholic, where as long as like all the games didn't go
Yeah.
into bid thief upsets, Catholic was going to be in, and that was probably the case for Guilford as well.
Yep.
Maybe they were going to be fine as long as it was like only 4 out of 5 or not 5 out of 5. Okay, Matt. Any other interesting observations or things that you see here as we've really had the opportunity to see the at large bid cut line play out in this first year under NPI?
It's just interesting. I think this was the case in the old system, but just with the numbers and the way everything was put together, it wasn't always clear the direct result of a win or a loss. I think following NPI, especially in the final days and final weeks, it was very clear if you win XYZ game, then your position will be thus, right? And and especially going into the last day when there's more knowns, just like a couple of games hanging out, it's this, it's more of a binary system, this or that. It's not having to make decisions. And it was that way all along, right? We focus on these championship week results, like are we in because we won this or out because this other team lost? But every game played to date has that effect. So you could say, Gustavus lost because of Cal Lou game happening, but there's probably a couple of games that could have flipped for them in the season. Definitely their own games, right? You have a chance
Right.
to win your
Right.
Pool A, or you have a chance to win a conference game or whatever. And they had a great season. They have nothing to feel ashamed about. It sucks not to make the tournament on the last day, but that's what it is. But it's all these results are cumulative throughout the entire season. And I think every team who missed the tournament has probably that one game in their mind. If you're one of these last like 4, 5, 6 teams out of the tournament, like, man, if we had that one game and that one result flipped, like we could have been one of those last teams into the tournament. And it's just in Division III with 43 automatic qualifiers and only 21 spots open, it's still like less than half a spot per conference. So it's still really, really hard to get these at-large bids into the tournament. And every game matters from November through now. What are we in? March 2nd. Every result mattered, and everyone had an opportunity to kind of change one or two results. There were no undefeated teams, right? So everyone could have won that one additional game or two additional games or win their AQ or whatever they needed to get into the tournament.
And I think we both mentioned at various times, it felt like under this system compared to the other one, that every result would matter and there was going to be a greater emphasis on continuing to win if you're kind of in that position. Whereas under the old system, you could get to a point where you could tread water a little bit more as long as you had a result that didn't really upset the balance of how you looked
Mm-hmm.
in terms of your winning percentage and strength of schedule. As we were coming down the stretch and there's more and more focus on what teams are in those Pool C spots, especially maybe those last 5. Um, I think we really see a couple examples where you can't uh, you can't take a regular season loss when you're kind of near that cut line and then follow it up with a conference tournament loss and still kind of expect to survive whatever bid thief
Yeah.
environment takes place. And I think that we see that with where we see Anderson and Whitworth Anderson dropped a game to Berea. Whitworth, following their regular season loss to Whitman. I know that really we saw the impacts in the projections, right? The simulations really hit them hard in down the stretch, to the point where it put them kind of in single digit range in terms of their at large bid viability. And that's really kind of what played out here, because I think in the end we had a real kind of I don't know if you'd say mild bid thief scenario, but kind of moderate, maybe kind of
Average, yeah,
average,
yeah,
right? And so here we see, that's the difference between, maybe being able to be right there for one of those last few spots, and here, we see Anderson as the third team out, Whitworth the fourth team out, and you talk about those results that you look back on and you wish you could have back.
yeah.
There's a couple there in the final weeks of the regular season that those two teams took.
Yeah, and to some degree, Gustavus Adolphus, right? They had the big win against St. John's that kind of
Oh
launched
yeah,
them
absolutely.
into a lot of top 25 ballots. Then they took the loss to Carleton and then lose again in the MIAC tournament. I think it was the semifinal that they lost in.
Semifinal to Carleton again.
Like you think they're so close, even just like reaching that final would probably have been so huge for them. But yeah, taking those losses really knocked them down a couple of pegs. And it just happened that there were a couple losses at the end of the season. And I think for those teams that you mentioned, Anderson, Whitworth, Gustavus, being so close, a couple of stronger games on your schedule could have made a big difference too, right? You do risk losing those, but if you win those rather than, I don't know all the specifics of their schedule, so they probably played a bunch of fine or good teams there too. But you take another little bit of a chance, you stretch yourself a little bit, and maybe you are in the tournament. So every game matters. The quality of your opponents is mattering, and which games you do win, I think it's all mattering. And everything has to come together. Again, precious few spots, only 21, less than half per conference. It's tough to get those.
Okay, so we've talked about the 43 automatic bids. We've talked about the 21 at-large bids. So let's move on here and start to talk about where this is all going. We know who's in, we know who's out. So let's talk about where everyone might end up. And bracketing this year is really going to start with those top 8 protected seeds. And that's going to mean that these teams are separated in the bracket such that they will not meet prior to a sectional final, right? Not
Yep.
before an Elite 8 round, right? So any of these teams is not going to see another one until should they all advance and they're playing for a chance to go to the Final Four, right? So as we entered the day, 7 of those 8 were locked up according to our simulations, and those 7 are all here. The one that was up for grabs was that number 8 spot. Let's just go here in order for the top 8 national seeds, Matt. Number 1 is Wesleyan, followed by New York University, UW-Platteville, and Trinity, Connecticut as the top 4. We would expect to see each of these teams be that top line team to have a quadrant built around them, right? And they would be grouped with what you'd think of as like a number 2 seed from the next 4, that being Emory, UW-La Crosse, Randolph-Macon, and then Tufts is the one who claimed that final number 8 spot, the final top 8 protected seed, after it was Illinois Wesleyan that entered the day with that number 8 spot. And as we were watching it play out, we think what it was that ultimately got Tufts into that spot was the win by Trinity, Connecticut over Wesleyan, because as we noted on the live stream, the dynamic at play there is that the win certainly helps Trinity, Connecticut, and Tufts played Trinity twice compared to once for Wesleyan. So that was going to have a little bit more of an outsized impact to have Trinity gain the resume advantage compared to Wesleyan. And then also there may have also been some help that Tufts got with Yeshiva winning a game on the final day, winning the Skyline Championship because Tufts had played them as well. And to the point where we knew, based on running the data either way, that even a Cal Lu win, who Illinois Wesleyan had played earlier in the year, was not going to be enough to move Illinois Wesleyan into that number 8 seed.
Yeah. And we know when it comes to the NCAA tournament Division III bracketing, geography has a lot to say with where teams get paired. The top 8 protected seeds are one way that geography will get broken, right? So the championships committee has set these new bracketing principles such that the top 4 overall teams in NPI will be kind of your top overall seed in each quadrant. Then the next 4 teams to round out the top 8 will be kind of like the 2 seeds overall in those quadrants opposite them, so that cannot be a matchup until to the national quarterfinals, I guess. Now that second line, the 5 through 8s, will get sort of paired geographically with those 1 through 4s, so it's not going to be a straight 1 through 8 seeding. But we saw in like soccer in the fall, a bunch, like 5 teams from the top 8 or so were like all from the NESCAC, but they had to separate those because it's the new bracketing principle. So this is the one spot really that we get to break from geography and say we will separate these teams. Now we're not granting them automatic hosting rights, but we're saying the NCAA is saying the matchups are protected, so you don't have to play another one of these top teams until the national quarterfinals. So this is the one kind of cool geography breaking thing we get to do, and maybe add a flight to protect the seeding. This is what the NCAA has said. So these are a big deal because you know that you do not have to play the most difficult potential matchups until the quarterfinals if you can get all the way there.
Now you have prepared a mock bracket for us to talk about here, and so let's move on to the mock bracket that you made tonight after the field was set, and maybe start talking through it in that top 8 context, right? So we have the top line where those top 4 seeds are across the top there, and then maybe talk about how you fit those next 4 within, how the top 4 are spread across the landscape.
So when I do a mock bracket, I just start by writing out the top 4 seeds from left to right. So that was Wesleyan, NYU, UW-Platteville, and Trinity, Connecticut. So Wesleyan would be what would become like the upper left quadrant if you were going to print out your March Madness bracket, and then NYU would be the upper right, and then Platteville would be the bottom right, and then you'd come back over Trinity, Connecticut would be the bottom left. So it's setting up a potential Final Four of Wesleyan and Trinity and NYU and Platteville. So that's just how that's organized, in case that matters to anyone. And then I come back down to the 2 seed line, which I have highlighted in yellow, and I try to pick the most even seeding matchup. So if I can get the 4 and the 5 to match up together within the geography, I will. Otherwise, I have to pick the next most logical team. So it's not a perfect 5, 6, 7, 8 back again from right to left, but you try to get that as much as possible. So the first option, the first most obvious thing is I was going to pair UW La Crosse with UW Platteville. That's the only geographic fit there. And in Division III geography, we talk about 500 miles. By the NCAA's official mileage calculator. That is the distance which they will pay to bus. Since NCAA handles all travel expenses, they would like to pay to bus teams and not pay to fly teams because that's a lot more expensive. So if you can get within 500 miles, it's a workable bracket. So that way I put La Crosse there. Then I went back and found the next team. The next most reasonable seed for Trinity would have been Randolph-Macon. That's a busable distance between Trinity, Connecticut, and Randolph-Macon in Virginia,
which we saw in the sectionals last year, so we know that works.
Yes. And then I kind of skipped over Emory, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, but I ended up pairing them with NYU for one reason. Emory and Atlanta is always a little bit of a geographic island. So if you talk about them advancing into the second weekend, you have to kind of provide them a link to the rest of the country. That ends up being, when you come back on the 3 seed line, Hampton-Sydney. Emory and Hampton-Sydney can bus to each other, and then Hampton-Sydney and NYU can bus to each other. So that kind of sets up a potential second weekend pod in Hampton-Sydney in Virginia. And that's sort of like a quote unquote, we'll call it legal geographic fit. So that's why I put Emory there. And then that puts Tufts and Wesleyan, 2 NESCAC teams, in the other quadrant. That's a natural geographic fit. That's also a 1 and 8 perfect seeding fit. So I think that's why something that they would pick as well. So that's how I lay out the beginning of the bracket. I just put the 1s and then I put the 2s, and I try to get that as much to make sense geographically as possible, and then I go from there. I should also note I use the 1 through 16 here. Division III will not actually label anything 1 through 16. It doesn't truly exist in Division III, but since we have an NPI list and we have essentially a seeding list, I might as well use this to try to get as most of my close to accurate seeding as possible to set up a tournament. We know we're going to have to move things around. A true 16 seed might have to be a 15 or even a 14 just to make geography work in certain places. We know that's going to happen all over the place. But as much as possible, why not stick to the seedings if you can, right?
For sure.
So then the next thing I do is I'll just keep going here as I go back through and I just pull out the 3s. So we're still within the top 16. I try to put the next teams in the 3 line. Here it kind of worked out to go more or less kind of backwards. Again, strong 3s are on the left and to weaker 3s on the right. Drew can kind of fit geographically with Wesleyan and Tufts, so I think that works. Now, we have heard that Drew did not submit paperwork to host. I think that has been confirmed by us. So that is going to be a pod. I'm still seeding Drew as the highest team and the kind of the quote unquote host team there, but that pod's going to have to be moved, which is noted in this bracket in green. But I did place them there. And then, as I discussed, I came over and placed Hampton-Sydney with Emory. Illinois Wesleyan, I think, naturally fits geographically with the UW school, so that makes sense. And then Christopher Newport is left, and they actually fit with Randolph-Macon, so that's kind of okay as well. Even if they can't directly bus to Trinity, we do have a potential host site in Randolph-Macon. And the way I think about host sites in the second weekend, I'm not sure exactly if this is what the committee does, but I just kind of play the game of if chalk holds, does this bracket work? And try to make it work that way. I don't play around too much with, well, if the number 7 team gets through, then what happens? I just kind of roll the dice, right? Try not to make it too ridiculous around that, but I'm just kind of saying if chalk holds, then does this work? And then trying to go from there. So I'm not trying to play too much of the game beyond that. So that makes me loop back around to 4 seeds. Put Montclair State with Trinity, Christopher Newport, Randolph-Macon. That all works geographically. Wash U, if you remember from the previous slide, they were actually the number 17 overall seed. But I think we need sort of a Midwest type host. So I think they're going to get kind of pulled up, even though they were maybe just outside the top 16, right? There's no guarantee that if you're in the top 16, you're one of these hosts. But I think you need a team here in this region. So I'm pulling Wash U into the 4 line. St. Thomas, Texas is a true kind of top 16 team after winning the SCAC, so I think they fit here. We always need at least one Region 10 pod, so I think it naturally fits with St. Thomas. Whether you host that at St. Thomas or at Hardin-Simmons, we've heard some maybe questionable things about St. Thomas's gym and whether or not the NCAA has told them that they cannot host. I'm not sure what's there, but either that's at St. Thomas or you just put it in Texas also at Hardin-Simmons, but I think that's a Region 10 pod there. And then my last kind of true host ended up being WPI, host them kind of in the northeast part of the country. So they were a true top 16 team. I think that means Hamilton was the last team that was actually a true top 16 seed, but I was not able to make host. They had to go on the 5 seed line. So that's how I started, and I set up kind of my 1 through 4s, the top 16 or so teams in the country. And then from there, I start filling in seeds that pair with those types of teams.
And it seems like down the stretch, we're always looking, is it going to be a California pod? Is it going to be a Texas pod? Is it maybe both? And as you mentioned that St. Thomas conveniently maybe is in that, reasonable top 16, host area anyway. Maybe that dynamic of having a third SCIAC team in means you kind of blow up California, and as I see here, you got one going to Texas, you got one going to that Wash U pod you were just talking about, and let's see, where did the other one Cal Lu going all the way to Trinity. So that's the kind of flight. Hey, once you're putting a team on a plane, I love seeing the ones that give us some really interesting matchups, and we would certainly get that with Cal Lu going out to all the way to the East Coast, playing in a pod in Hartford.
And with Region 10 teams, I'm always kind of thinking about Emory, right? So that since they're almost an island down there in Georgia, I'm thinking, can I fill that with a Region 10 team? We had a pretty natural seeding with Guilford. I think they can fit pretty well in an Emory pod since they won that ODAC. Their seeding increased. I think they would be like a strong number 2 team in that pod. I think that works. And then we have 2 other geographical outliers, Barry and Huntingdon. And I think they kind of work in that pod too. Like Barry's a true 15 or 16, so that works. Huntingdon's more like a true 12, so they're a little bit of a stretch to get into the number kind of 10 seed zone there. But really in Division III, when you're talking about moving 2 seed lines to really help to make isolated geography work, that's not that bad at all. They're going to do that all day. It's pretty fair and pretty natural seeding, especially if you're looking at Guilford's kind of more like a 6 than a 7. If Huntingdon's a little bit worse than a 10, like really it all comes out in the wash. I think that's a good pod. There are other things they could do, like Guilford could maybe go somewhere else, and maybe you do put it like a Cal Lutheran or a Redlands or something there. That's definitely possible, but I really see it pretty natural of Guilford, Huntingdon, Emory, and Barry.
And so we'll get the official bracket released. The selection show for the men's basketball tournament will be at noon Eastern time on Monday, March 3rd. And so sometimes there's some reactions that might be a little bit knee jerk, but there's maybe some some reason behind the scenes that we don't know about. We've touched on a few of those, like Drew being a host in position, but it sounds like has not bid. I know there's been some questions about some other bids that the NCAA may or may not
Yeah.
look at favorably. One of them that we've talked about certainly has been with UW Lacrosse. Their main gym is going to be utilized by a gymnastics event, so it's not available, but they still have bid on an alternate site, but it has not been made clear to us whether that will be acceptable. So all that to say, sometimes there's surprises in the bracket or things that maybe seem weird, and there can often be a good reason for that. But it's something that's not obvious to us, and but I really like the process of mock bracketing, Matt, because forcing the exercise to go through it really can reveal some challenges or some
Hmm.
constraints that the committee might be under. So I'm wondering if there's anything that you really thought about as you were going through the exercise that, once we see that bracket, that, to someone who hasn't gone through the exercise to put together a bracket that might seem a little bit odd or out of place, that you would say, yeah, I get it because I went through this and dealt with the same thing. Is there anything like to that degree? Or is it just a matter of, maybe they just made different decisions?
I think a lot of places there's just different decisions you can make, and a lot of them are reasonable, right? We've heard that Drew did not submit paperwork to host, and I don't know the reason. Like, I don't know if their facilities are occupied or what. We know that NYU, that Illinois Wesleyan, and that Randolph Macon's men's basketball team cannot host because their women are in similar position, and this is an odd numbered year, which means that women's basketball has priority in the first weekend. So we know we need alternate host sites, and there's a bunch of places you could go. Like NYU I put them at TCNJ. They could go all the way out to John Carroll if you wanted to try to add some other like Great Lakesy or Midwest type teams in there. You could do that. You could put them at Keene State and try to go even more northeast with that NYU pod. You could do a bunch of different things. Randolph Macon, I put them at Stockton. You could put a team like Denison there. You could put a team like John Carroll there. A bunch of different things you could do with Randolph Macon. It ended up being that the NJAC was a couple of beneficiaries of alternate hosting on this mock bracket. I don't know if the committee will think about, is that too much for the? I don't think they'll care, but they're definitely geographically kind of central enough to make that happen. The other one that's kind of interesting that I did is I decided to put Illinois Wesleyan up at St. Norbert, who would be the number 3 in that pod. But just looking at kind of how the teams ended up, especially with Wisconsin Lutheran, the teams ending up kind of in that Midwest, what's called the Midwest quadrant, that don't really have a whole lot of other options. The next highest seed after Wash U when it came to NYU was St. John's. They can't get to Wash U under 500 miles. I don't believe. So the next team they would be like the more natural 5 seed. So the next team, they can't get to Illinois Wesleyan either. But if you put a host kind of what I'll call in the middle of those two, you can get St. John's and Illinois Wesleyan in the same pod, which would be maybe better for seeding if you got those two teams together. So at a place like St. Norbert. Then you jump back up. The next team is Carthage. So you plop them with Wash U just to make the geography and the seeding pretty natural. Wisconsin Lutheran would be kind of the third team out of hosting position. Okay, so put them with UW La Crosse. That works. Then you jump back up to Calvin and Chicago, UW Platteville. That works geographically and seeding-wise fairly okay. Those are two teams that actually I don't remember Calvin and Chicago playing in a long time forever. So that'd be an interesting matchup. We have seen Calvin play Platteville this year, so as a potential second round matchup, that could be a rematch. And then now you're starting to look at filling out like the 3 and the 4 seeds in each of those pods. And then so it comes down to like, can I make the geography work with St. John's and Illinois Wesleyan? Oh yeah, I can with a team like St. Norbert. And then you say, okay, Franklin works with UW La Crosse. Actually, it's kind of a haul from Indiana, but it fits. Can I fly in a team like Claremont Mudscripps to Wash U? Sure, let's do it. And then you just fill out kind of the bottom seeds, and you say, yeah, this geography works. So maybe we could see something like that happen. I don't know if they'll pick the 3 seed. I think I'm inclined to say they would do something like that. But I could very much see just different choices, right? That could be at Wisconsin Lutheran, and St. John's could be at UW La Crosse. Maybe you flip St. Norbert and Franklin in the process, something like that, right? So seating would stay reasonable any way you do that. So these are just different choices the committee could make. None of them are necessarily inherently right or wrong. Teams are essentially on the right seed line, plus or minus one, which is really, again, not a big deal when it comes to Division III bracketing, especially if you go back like 10, 15, 20 years and what the brackets used to look like to where they are now. I think the committees have been doing such a much better job doing two things at once, which is hard, balancing the bracket geographically and balancing the bracket for like seating and bracket integrity. I think they've been doing a great job on that.
Well, at this point, we're just basically hours away from seeing the official bracket. It'll be a lot of fun to see what it is. Maybe compare the scenarios you work through to what the scenarios the men's basketball committee ultimately chose on, and looking forward to being able to talk about it.
Yeah, it'll be fun.
All right, Matt, let's wrap up this wrap up show, and give another word of thanks here to all our great supporters on Patreon, patreon.com/D3Datacast. Honored to be joined in that group with Dan B earlier today. Shout out to Dan B. Happy to have you along for the ride, and happy to have the support of everyone else named here on this list.
We enjoy the D3 community. Thank you so much for partnering with us. We can't tell you enough how much it means to us. It's great to be able to help us to run d3datacast.com, pay the hosting fees, be able to do that without placing ads on the site, produce these episodes, things like that. So thank you very much. If you're interested in joining us on either the $3 or the $5 tier, it's not that much. Patreon.com/D3Datacast. You can join there. We would appreciate it. Zach, had a lot of fun with you talking a lot about Division III basketball today on Sunday. Let's get out of here so we can release this episode. So for now, we're going to say, good job, team.